a couple of applications are backed up at the completion of that project before we move on to something else, having the ability to trigger that backup to occur on a more of an event-driven basis is certainly important. And when we think about recovering the application, the automation comes into play because it can bring those different components back in the proper sequence to make sure that, again, the application is going to be brought back up and it's going to operate correctly as it should, and to do that really as quickly as possible. Self-service recovery is important. So we've talked about, developers really being obviously very hands-on and driving adoption of Kubernetes. So, and another thing we've kind of talked about is the fact that Kubernetes apps are moving into production. Even in cases of test and dev, data protection becomes important because developers might need to, roll back to a period in time, previous to the current. Maybe there was, an error in the code that they need to kind of roll back to a certain point in time before that occurred. So not only the ability to do that, but the ability to allow the developer to kind of handle that directly on a self-service basis and not have to wait for IT. That's certainly something that we're hearing be important in this space. And then finally on the slide here, granular recovery options. So especially if we think about a cyber attack like ransomware, not only can it be very beneficial to execute sort of a large-scale recovery, for example, of multiple clusters, but also the ability to be a little bit more surgical and precise with it, especially if you can have insight into specific files, for example, that were impacted by the ransomware. So being able to, again, have that flexibility as well to be more granular with the recovery, what exactly is being recovered, is becoming more important, especially with ransomware. We've talked a little bit about the mobility of data and applications. Not only kind of migrating them can be important, but also one thing that we hear is that customers might want to be able to recover or replicate into a different namespace or even to a different provider. I know we talked a little bit about maybe an entire region in a cloud provider experiencing an outage, for example. Customers tend to get, that we speak with, tend to not want to put all of their eggs in one basket in case that were to happen. And just one other comment I would say to make on the mobility component. This can be important if, especially if a customer is running in the cloud. Cloud providers are bringing out new features and functionalities all the time. They're updating their pricing all the time. So they're looking for that flexibility to be able to, migrate depending on their business requirements and depending on how the different offerings change and evolve with time. And security is a very important area. We've talked a little bit already about ransomware a couple times. So looking at from a data protection standpoint, so we have both role-based access control and identity and access management. So role-based access control essentially determines who has the ability to do what in an organization, for lack of a more eloquent way to put it. So it's the ability to determine, for example, which users have the ability to access and recover certain backup files would be a good example. And then the identity and access management is essentially controls different users and assigns them their role, essentially is kind of a way to think about it. But essentially they're security constructs and they can help to make sure that a bad actor is not able to access the backup environment, is really kind of the importance here. Token authentication is one. This is another means that we see within the Kubernetes space that is used in order to be able to provide access to certain pieces of the environment. So that's one thing to look out for. And then the last couple of pieces are data immutability and data encryption. So for data immutability, this is essentially means that in the backup space, essentially it means that the file or the data, it cannot be altered, it cannot be deleted until a certain point in time. So of course that can become important if an attacker looks to enter the environment, and then obviously then they're not able to change or manipulate the file. One thing that is important to keep in mind is that the access controls also become important because files can be re-encrypted and things of that nature. So we do see the need for all of these capabilities to sort of work together to be able to come a more layered security defense in order to be more resilient against these attacks. And then data encryption as well, of course, that's if a bad actor is able to access the data, it just makes it one step harder for them to be able to access and change or manipulate the files. And just actually just a quick summary here. So it's certainly a space, again, that we're seeing kind of develop over the last couple of years, and we think it really will continue to develop over the next couple of years as well. And the big need that we're seeing in the market is, I kind of referenced a little bit, the education. So what are the tools and capabilities that are out there today? What should IT be thinking about when it comes to data protection for these environments? Why might we think about using kind of a third-party tool? And really, we're seeing these decisions need to be done in collaboration with the line of business. We're seeing that they need to be done in collaboration with the security teams as well, and with, of course, development teams as well. Kind of on the line a little bit more on the business side, of course, but really to make sure that not only are the features and functionalities that the business is looking for kind of are there and are met, but also that the requirements for cybersecurity, compliance, things of that nature are being met. And we certainly, always advise customers to be keeping those business SLAs in mind in terms of being able to, validate and really prove that they can meet, those RPOs and they can meet those RTOs. That was actually all I had, so I'd be happy to take any questions if we have them.
Yes, I have one.
Hi.
In your evaluation, did you also look besides typical backup tools to means or reconciliation means of actually recreating the data from other systems? Because you're really focusing on one single application, and restoring from a backup, because there was a user deleted data, always means that you are traveling back in time, which is usually worse than actually that piece of data, because then you even lose more data. Especially when you are late in detecting that actually some data was lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think backup tools are good to have clones, like you also put on your slide, but in reality, we hardly use backups in case we lose some data. So I'm curious if that also in your evaluation showed up.
Sure. So to sort of maybe repeat the question, I think you're asking about almost sort of the trade-off between, I do have an incident where I've lost data, but essentially if recovering from the backup, then I might end up losing a little bit more. Is that sort of what you're asking? Yeah, and it's, I would say certainly a difficult question, especially not only just user-deleted data, but when we see, for example, ransomware attacks, especially if they're targeting the backup environment, it can be very difficult to know when exactly they penetrated that environment, to know when the last known good point to recover to is. So, we see, for example, certain data analytics tools that are being brought to be able to identify when those recovery points may be. we are seeing that oftentimes backup data is being integrated into security event management SIEM tools as well that kind of look not only just within the backup but in the broader environment. So it's, I would say, a little bit of a trade-off, and that's where the relationship with the business and knowing, you know, when to take those backups and how frequently to take those backups is going to come into play. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Apologies if you covered this.
Sure.
But this is, I guess, is 2 points. One is, do you have this available in like a white paper or a flip book or something? Because I know somebody that would enjoy reading through all this. But second, is there a second part to this where you guys tried to identify solutions for all of these problems?
Yeah. So we do. The question was, do we have a white paper? We do have something that we published somewhat recently that covers a lot of these points that I'd be happy to share. And yes, I mean, we do have the ability to kind of talk one-on-one about, you know, under engagement, but we do have the ability to kind of talk about, you know, different solutions and kind of mapping those to your requirements, if that's what you're asking. Yeah, great.
So I'm relatively new to Kubernetes, and I was wondering what are some of the different integrations for data protection that are involved. The one thing I'm learning is that there are a lot of different integrations depending on what you're looking to do,
Mm-hmm.
and I find that that's my weak point is that I can throw out names and I have no idea what it is.
So can you extrapolate on what you mean by specific integrations?
For instance, I was talking to Kimberly, and I was telling that we use Rancher, which is an integration for Kubernetes, but until I actually got into it and somebody explained to me what it is, Rancher was just another name for me. You know, Longhorn is another one, and just different integrations on, and they have specific tasks for what those integrations do. But for data
Mm-hmm.
protection, what are some of those like companies or integration applications that work with Kubernetes?
Sure. So typically, in this, some of the tools that I'm referencing are going to be third-party software, kind of that's developed specifically for data protection. So looking beyond kind of specifically Rancher, for example, and what it can do. And so it would sort of depend on the different backup software. They're typically being expanded to support all these major distributions and integration points, but that's where we would want to be looking at, you know, the specific environment and what's being in use. I'm not sure. Does that answer the question?
Yeah,
Okay.
like if you have pure storage,
Yep.
this, and NetApps, then it's probably that.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. Sure. Thank you.
The recovery SLAs, specifically on RTO, are you seeing people being worried about like lower RTOs? What kind of implementations are you seeing out there?
Yeah, certainly. You know, so the question was around RTOs, so that's recovery time objectives, and essentially how long the application can be down or offline for. And so we always advise customers to have sort of a tiered strategy and really to look at their workloads and what, you know, how much availability do they need, because naturally the you know, the less downtime, the more stringent the RTO. Typically, the more expensive a solution is going to be in order to facilitate that. It's just the way it works. But absolutely, you know, we're seeing that there's less and less tolerance for any downtime at all. And if there is downtime, it can be very minimal. So we're seeing the pressure from that standpoint as well. And that's where, you know, things like replication, for example, can come in and, you know, really making sure to have a backup strategy that kind of, you know, covers those different use cases.